Hello, all. Welcome, welcome. We are going to get started in just a second. Glad everybody could join us, and we'll just keep letting folks trickle into the room as they're able. So, hello, all, and welcome to today's webinar, Caught Between Two Fires, a conversation on the uncomfortable reality of criminalized survivorship. My name is Ayana Wallace View, and I'm one of the training and technical assistance managers with Ujima, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. I hope that you all are as geared up for this conversation as I am and ready to unpack the intersections of survivorship and systems within the lives of Black women survivors and within domestic violence advocacy. We have an amazing panel joining us today, and I'll introduce our speakers in just a moment. Before we jump into the conversation, please note that we should have available both the chat and Q&A boxes. If you're having trouble using the Q&A, just drop it in the chat. But if you have specific questions, try to use the Q&A. It'll help us catch it a little bit better. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have time to answer some of those additional questions that might pop up. I'm going to start my introductions with my Ujima sis, Letitia Davis Pike. Letitia Davis Pike is the program manager at Ujima, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community, where she leads the domestic violence fatality review teamwork and project to enhance the cultural responsiveness of fatality review teams. With over 14 years of experience in the violence against women movement, she previously worked with the Louisiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence as Director of Public Affairs and Ally Engagement. She managed the agency's strategic communications, training and technical assistance, and domestic violence prevention. Earlier in her career, Letitia provided trauma-informed care in a crisis shelter, and she has been involved in the extensive legal and system advocacy, including co-founding the Family Justice Center of say the name for me, Letitia. You know how my
It's okay. Family Justice Center of Acadiana.
Acadiana. There we go. And she was actively involved in multiple task force and was certified in danger assessment work and also has done some group facilitation for offenders. So very multi-talented, multifaceted, a really great resource and a great colleague as well. Thank you,
Thank
Letitia, for
you.
joining us.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Next up, we have the incredible Crystal McLeod. Crystal and I actually just met not too long ago and had a great brunch conversation, which has stayed with me. So I'm really glad to have you here. Crystal is really, really, really dynamic and insightful. Crystal McLeod is a national restorative justice practitioner and advocate and serves as a co-executive director and chief program officer for the NYU Center on Violence and Recovery, where she leads a multidisciplinary team advancing restorative responses to violence. She oversees federal and local restorative justice training and technical assistance efforts nationwide, including directing CVR's Restorative Practices Technical Assistance Pilot Program, funded by the U.S. Department of Justice. Her work focuses on building survivor-centered restorative justice initiatives that respond meaningfully to community needs. So, Crystal, thank you, thank you, thank you for joining us and making your schedule work. We appreciate you jumping into the convo.
Thank you so much, Diana. It's a gift to be here and so grateful to be among such beautiful other panelists. So thanks for having me.
And then last, but of course not least, we have the outstanding Kimba Smith Pradia, who I am just meeting but have heard amazing things. And so I'm really glad that we were able to connect. Kimba is a nationally recognized advocate for criminal justice reform, whose powerful story of resilience and redemption brought nationwide attention to mass incarceration and injustice in the 1990s. After a highly publicized legal battle and a presidential commutation from President Bill Clinton, Kimba became a voice for those impacted by the legal system. She is the author of memoir Poster Child and an award-winning executive producer of the film Kimba. Kimba has collaborated with members of Congress and the United Nations, courageously speaking truth to power through her testimony. She's led training for federal and state probation organizations and worked with groups such as the NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, the Sentencing Project, the NAACP, and the ACLU to influence policy. Her work has included national campaigns focused on fair sentencing, clemency, voter rights, reentry, building trust with law enforcement, and women in mass incarceration. Kimba's story has also served as an educational tool for youth and women, encouraging healthier choices in relationships and a better understanding of long-term consequences. It has also motivated individuals across academic and professional disciplines to become advocates for social justice. As a public speaker, she's delivered keynote presentations at hundreds of colleges and national professional conferences across the country. Kimba is currently an HBCU fellow with Virginia Humanities and was an Equity in Action visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania in 2024 to 2025. That's really exciting. She also served on the Drug Policy Alliance's board of directors for over 5 years and is an active member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and the NAACP. She has also served on the Virginia Criminal Sentencing Commission and Virginia Parole Board, appointed by Governors Terry McAuliffe and Ralph Northam, respectively. She has advised officials from state houses to the White House. In January 2025, in recognition of her years of advocacy, President Biden granted Kimba a full presidential pardon. Ultimately, Kimba believes that there is a lesson in every life experience. She has embraced her experience, learned from it, and now uses it to teach others. So, obviously, last but not least. And again, thank you so much for
Thank you.
joining us and for bringing everything that you will to this conversation.
Thank you, Ayana. I mean, it's an honor and also a privilege, and I'm humbled to be on the panel with you all and Crystal and Letitia, and you all are out there on the ground doing the work. So whenever I'm able to collaborate with you all, it's a blessing for me too. Thank you.
All right, y'all. So I'm a jump in person and we only have so much time. So I'm gonna jump in to these questions and whoever wants to start us out with answering, please just go ahead and jump in as well. So, first question, what comes to mind, just the first thing that comes to mind when you think about the intersections of survivorship, domestic violence, legal systems, and the child welfare system as well?
A lot of what I do has to do with me being transparent about my own situation. So the first thing that comes to mind when I hear those four words was just the fact that, I was a young college student years ago and naive and basically, got into this relationship with a drug dealer and it being bigger than I could control or handle. There was grooming that was going on, and initially, he was Mr. Knight in shining armor, but then there were certain red flags, and it got to a point where, to fast forward, where he started abusing me, and then he killed his best friend because he thought his best friend was cooperating with the authorities. And I was young. I didn't know how to get out of it. When you talk about the legal systems, um, basically, I ended up turning myself in 6.5 months pregnant. The government wanted me to cooperate and give them him. The prosecutor said I never handled or used any of the drugs that were involved, but yet and still, he was still trying to hold me accountable for 255 keys of crack cocaine. That's a whole nother topic with conspiracy drug laws, but ultimately, no one saw me or heard me when there was domestic violence testimony about what I had gone through. Some of my friends testified with the abuse. The 86-year-old judge that was over my sentencing hearing case, he was actually asleep during this testimony, and none of it mattered. He still chose to sentence me to 24 and a half years in federal prison. And, no one, everyone knew that he was abusive and violent, but no one actually sat me down to talk about my fear. And ultimately, I ended up going into a prison system 6.5 months pregnant and scared to get death. They had me on suicide watch. I ended up giving birth to my son, and my leg had to be handcuffed and shackled to the bed. At one point, the system wanted to transfer me to a federal facility that was hundreds of miles away from my parents. And so, again, long story short, I was grateful for the woman that was head of the hospital at the time. And basically, after I gave birth to my son, the U.S. Marshal stormed into my hospital room and said that my leg had to be handcuffed and shackled to the bed at all times. I couldn't have any visitors. Two correctional officers needed to guard me. But had not the woman come into my room and basically said, "This is my hospital. I'm going to run it the way that I want to," she allowed my parents to stay in the room next door. Had that not happened, my son would have automatically gone into the social service system because there wouldn't have been anybody there to take custody of him. And so, and just lastly, even after, going through the trauma of being in county jail, not having any physical contact with him, after giving birth to him, being transferred to a prison, in California, miles away, no one thought about as far as child welfare, as far as what impact that could have on my son. And so I can remember my dad telling me that, my son wouldn't stop crying when they first brought him home as a newborn infant. And so it wasn't until they started putting some of my clothes and put his bassinet in my room where he was able to calm down. But yeah, as far as the child welfare system, um, people, society, our government was more concerned about punishing me instead of treating me as a victim and also punishing my son by not having me home with him because eventually I was released from federal prison after a huge movement. And, I'm grateful for the movement. I'm considered poster child for the issues, but it shouldn't have mattered that, I was my parents' only child, that you had these Black affluent women's organizations that were supporting me. They weren't just supporting me, they were supporting the fact that there were hundreds of other Black women that deserve justice too. And so, in closing, that's why I've been so dedicated to continuously telling this story over and over, to humanize it and to get people to understand that there are mitigating circumstances that lead one down this path.
Thank you so much for just sharing and being willing to, retell your story. It's so much in there, and so many layers just to just even think about. I can hardly imagine what that experience must have been, but I really, really appreciate you doing the advocacy work and following through and making, the change lasting. So
You're
other
welcome.
folks,
Thank
I know
you.
I saw a lot of reactions as she was talking.
Yeah,
Yeah.
echoing Kemba, I'm just so grateful that we start in story, right? Because we can talk about these things on an intellectual, theoretical level, but we need to ground this in this. These are real people's lives, right? And not doing anything or continuing in the way that we have been results in people being crushed by oppression. So I'm
Yeah.
just really grateful for you to share your story, your sacred story with us, and for us to start there. And building on it, the first thing that came to mind, and your story reflects it beautifully, is these systems were not created for us. I want to be very, very clear about that. They weren't created for us. They weren't designed for us. And in fact, they are intersectional, right? So you see the linking of prison to child welfare, and this virus going in between, which is really punishment and carcerality. But before we, talk about what that looks like on the practical level, we need to zoom out of like, how did we get here in the first place? I often say this joke, folks have heard it before, of like, I was trying to articulate early on, like, how, the violent, like, how did we get to this violent state that we are a part of? And I made this joke and I said, when people flee oppression and or persecution without healing first, they create America. Um, And I want to be real clear on that because the work that I'm dedicated to is how do we not recreate the violent social context in which we're in. But first, we need to start on how it was created, that this country was founded on genocide and slavery. From that space, abusive values have been uplifted. What are the abusive values you even see reflected for me when I hear your story, Kemba, is the disposability, right? That some bodies are just not as important as other bodies. You could call the disposability, expendability. And with that, actually, some bodies deserve a presumption of criminality, right? So not also are they're expendable, they're presumed dangerous, right? And so we need
Yes.
to manage, we need to control, we need to exploit, and we need to extract, right? And then power, control, carcerality, punishment, oppressive hierarchy, these values, abusive values have been seeped into our context. And then what do? We build institutions from that place, right? So it's really interesting because I'm so grateful that we're talking about systems in the broadest sense, right? You brought up child welfare. You didn't just bring up the criminal legal system and it makes sense because these abusive values are part of everything that we do. We could even talk about education and the way that education has deemed Black children disposable and
Yes.
expendable, right? And now actually when you're just wanting to participate in class, all of a sudden you're labeled as hyperactive and you can't be in the class. You need to be in this other class. That's what these systems do. So that's what comes up for me is we need to just ground in actually these systems are designed to do exactly what they're doing, right? They're not it's not that we need to reform these systems. We need to come to a very different imagination that actually puts Black folks at the center and believes that our humanity is worth preserving, that we are deserving, that we are lovable, and actually we should never be thrown out, right? So just want to really appreciate the story and also want to ground in the fact that um, this wasn't created for us.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Letitia, did you want to add? I know I'm kind of gearing you up for the next question, to be honest.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Absolutely. And I think my points, of course, kind of reiterate what Kimba and Crystal already stated, but these systems are very complex. It could be very overwhelming and unjust, especially for survivors of color. I mean, just the reality of it, these systems aren't Black victim friendly. And as Crystal stated, they weren't created for us. So that was the intention of it. But oftentimes, what I've heard from survivors I've worked with, that sometimes the systems cause more harm than help. And they just rather not deal with it. Then, of course, then that leads to, lack of resources and lack of assistance when it's most vitally needed. But just hearing Kimber's story, and when I think of these systems, I also think of the resilience that is required to navigate these systems. You know, navigating it sometimes with impossible circumstances while still trying to advocate for yourself, your children, your safety, and your stability isn't always easy. So, Kimba, thank you again for sharing your story.
You're welcome. I just represent the many women and just I know you have another question, Ayana, but when you talk about resilience, I had the opportunity to screen my film in one prison I remember in particular was many of them, but one was the Ohio Reformatory for Women. And I actually sat in the audience with the women and just to see like their reaction and how they could relate to all the things that were in the movie and how, we were crying together. And then when we sat in a room and had a small group conversation, and one of the women was sharing their identical experience, and she said, thank you so much, for coming in and taking the time out. But I'm looking at her like she has done 3 decades in prison and has a similar story. And so that's where I'm just like looking at her and just like, no, I want you to see freedom in me because you need to be out here doing the same thing. And that resilience and for her to still have a right mind. But there are so many women that have so many stories. And, Ayana, I'm gonna let you go. But one of the things that irritates me is that oftentimes we live in a society, in particular in our communities, where people want to blame the victim and not really understand all the complexities of people staying in those type relationships.
Hmm. Hmm. And so that actually leads me right to my next question. The system tells us there's an ideal victim. What does that person look like according to the system, and what assumptions are made about that person? And then, sort of on the opposite side of that, how are we seeing implicit bias or prejudice or stereotypes shape the way other survivors are experiencing systems?
Right. So when I think of the ideal victim, of course, just doing this work and working with survivors, they were usually looking at survivors basically how they're expected to behave, usually how they respond and present themselves. So it really mattered when survivors were going to court how they're dressed, how do they speak, and all of those things played a part into how much assistance they would receive, unfortunately. It's very harmful, of course, because a lot of times victims don't always, of course, with the impact of trauma, they don't always cooperate with systems. They may recant their stories, or even with trauma, they may not remember chronologically. So a lot of times they're perceived as lying. They're not believed. So these stereotypes are very harmful on what a perfect victim look like, and that they're supposed to be innocent, right? And a lot of times white black women aren't perceived as victims a lot of times because we're too strong. We would never let that happen to us, that black strong woman stereotype, which I know we're going to get into. But absolutely it can be very harmful, and there are still stereotypes about what the perfect victim looks like, and it prohibits what kind of services the survivor get, not only in our judicial systems but also sometime in shelters. The perfect victim usually gets more support and resources that are available in those sort of settings as well.
Absolutely. Um, and so Letitia, since we're I was just listening to you. You mentioned just a little bit ago about navigating systems and how difficult, and Crystal, you did as well, about how difficult it is to just navigate systems on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
What might system navigation look like or require from survivors on a day-to-day basis? And how does navigating overlapping systems increase things like economic, financial, or psychological burdens experienced by survivors?
Absolutely. So navigating systems might include filing protection orders, attending court hearings. There's multiple court hearings, communicating with law enforcement, your attorneys, responding to child welfare investigations, trying to secure safe housing, or shelter. Access to counseling, healthcare, all of those things. And a lot of time also just having to repeat the traumatic experiences to multiple professionals, having to tell their story over and over again, which could also be re-traumatizing. But I've worked with thousands of victims, and it was not easy. In I know in my parish, it's a county, but we call it parishes here in Louisiana. It will require an entire day to file a protection order. Even with my assistance, just helping them with the petition. The petition was probably, if I can recall, probably 18 pages. And then she had to include all of her allegations, just trying to make sure that she include everything, because then all of the time invested, if it's not good enough, then judges may even dismiss it, and having to wait around for a judge to sign it. And then the anticipation and the worry, now he's going to get served with it, especially if she's asking for access of the home or need custody of her children, and the perpetrator have a possession of the kids. That entire process is an entire day, and we're not even thinking about survivors missing work, not only for these appointments with medical advocates, attorneys, court dates, while already trying to sustain for their kids and themselves. The financial burden, of course, then they may rack up court costs, transportation, childcare. So all of those things contribute to unfortunate circumstances for survivors. So um, it's not easy to navigate, and it's very difficult, and it's an extreme burden on most survivors navigating these systems.
Hmm.
Even
Absolutely.
even with a family justice center in place, because
Yeah.
I worked at a family justice center where all these services were co-located, and it decreased some of those barriers, right? But not all. So it was still burdensome.
Yeah. And then I'm not gonna jump in too much because Letitia knows I go on a whole tangent. But I was just also thinking about, with family justice centers, love them because they're in a lot of senses they're one-stop shops, but they're also law enforcement based. So if you have a survivor that has a warrant that tries to go in to get their protective order, they're more than likely gonna get arrested, right? Like that was an experience that I had that I
Wow.
hadn't really thought about, like before I entered advocacy, like how systems don't actually line up to support survivors in the best way. I hadn't really considered
Right.
that until it was like, oh, we sent them there to get this order that they're supposed to do, and now they're getting arrested, right? So, Crystal or Kemba, did you want to add anything?
You go, Kemba.
Just briefly, one of the things as far as navigating systems, and I think one of the things a lot of people didn't understand with me and with other women that I know that experience it, with other women's stories that I've heard, is you can be harmed by someone, and because you just love differently from other people. And with my particular case, the government wanted me to give them him, but they also had him on the number one most wanted list, and he was supposed to get the death penalty. And here I am, pregnant with his son, and obviously there was a level of fear, but there also was a level of still love.
Hmm.
And that's something that's really hard to talk about because then you're so judged because how could you possibly have these feelings? And so um, it's navigating the system where we need to have cultural responses to our communities because, unfortunately, we still have the mindset of protect your man, from back in the day and music lyrics and everything. But sometimes women may not want the severity of criminalization. And then also, and I know this is a touchy topic. I mean, because I do think there does need to be justice. But also too, we just need to think about the overall harm that that would do, and if there's other remedies of as far as behavioral modification for that individual that may not be so harmful for the whole family. And oftentimes, and I know this may be going into the next question, I mean, I can tell you the amount of times I went to a high school to speak, and there's a long line of kids that want to come talk to me because I've been so transparent about my hurt and pain, and they want to come and tell me what they're going through. And they don't want to turn in their mother and their father, the only two people that, even though how dysfunctional that love may be in the household, we need to start thinking about how can we solve problems that aren't as harmful that may send their father away for 20, 30 years. So I'll just do a hard stop there.
Yeah, thank you.
All of that, all of that, all of that. You know, what I'm sitting with in that story, Kemba and Letitia, I'm so grateful, for these reflections. Is the question? Well, and Ayana, when you first asked the question, I was like, "Girl, how real are we supposed to get here?" Because
Oh,
mama
listen.
told me to move the script, so sometimes I just be saying all the things. So I'm guessing this is a space where we could just be real with our people.
Yes.
Wonderful.
No,
My kind of space. That's all of our kind of space. You know, we got to talk about how we got here. And it goes back to this story of design, right? And who this system was designed for. And Letitia, you were talking about, and Kemba, your story reflects that, of like, let's go back to the fact that when the violence against women's movement advocated for criminalization as the primary response to
Hmm.
gender-based violence, who were the women that and non-binary non-binary folks that were lifting up their hands and saying, whoa, 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 the violence in my life is serious, and I don't trust law enforcement, and I don't trust the system, and I love my man, and yes, he needs to do differently. And I'm using gendered
Yeah.
terminology, recognizing that it's actually far more expensive. My partner, I want accountability. And I want them to heal, right? Who was lifting their hands up and saying that? Women of color, Black women. And whose voices were ignored? Whose voices did people say, all right, but we can't do that complexity. We'd rather do this little box. Are ours, right? And so now we're left with a system that reduces the complexity of domestic violence and what we want. So, what does it say about survivors? I'm going to speak about Black survivors in particular. What does it say? Well, one, oh, survivors don't love the people that they're with, the people that are hurting them. What are you talking about? And this is my thing too, when we say these things of like, if I were to ask anyone, and we're loving your comments in the chat and all the things, so please, it keeps us just like engaged and seeing you and feeling um everyone, if I was to ask you, do you have someone in your life that you love and you simultaneously cannot stand? We would all say yes. Okay. You know, and so we know how to hold the complexity of the both and, right? And survivors know that too, right? That I can have, the father of my kid, someone I was in love with, and hold the fact that they hurt me. And hold the fact that I can't believe that they hurt me after all they know that I've gone through, after the stories I've told them, right? And so the system abstracts that and throws that out. What it also does is forces survivors to put themselves in this box that they can't go into. So you can't be a survivor that's used violence, when often violence is a survival strategy to
Right.
survive this harmful context in which we are in, right? So, oh, sorry, my thing is freezing up. My thing is catching the spirit
I can
too.
still hear you.
Okay, great.
We can hear you perfect.
Thank you. Thank you, Kava. So yeah, to your point, Ayana, in terms of having a warrant and also being someone who's been abused, and needing services, no, you got to choose one or the other, and it just reminds me too, in my own survivor story of this real painful thing that I feel like happens to a lot of Black women, non-binary folks, of like having to choose their Blackness over their survivorship, right? Or their gender or how they identify. So, wanting, as you were sharing, Kemba, wanting accountability, but also, similar for myself, I loved the person that hurt me. And I didn't want the person that hurt me to be, crushed or reduced in the system context to the worst thing that he ever did at the time, right? Just like I didn't see myself as the worst thing that ever happened to me. So I think the history of these systems have also really placed us in this box that we need to break out of. And a part of that looks like, how do we create systems that actually include us and include the complexities that we know about survivors, and the people who've harmed them.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And
I
so, oh, go ahead, Kemba.
just how you break it down is amazing, but it's just even in that box that you were saying, like even when I was in the system and attention was coming to my case, I felt like I had to lean more on the fear because if I spoke more to, I cared for him, society was going to judge me and again I have to in this session big up Beth Ritchie, who was actually coming in to counsel me in the prison, and she helped me understand that my what I was feeling was okay and that I shouldn't feel bad for it. But in coming out and even doing the film, when we think about systems and again child welfare, like, why would we want our kids to think that we never loved this person, that all there was fear? Because otherwise, then we'll teach our kids that this person was just a monster. And so that's why in raising my son, it was really important for me to focus on his behavior versus how he was as an overall person. And even in his character in this film, it was very important to how he was characterized as well. So I'll just stop. But yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I
I
think
think. Oh, go ahead, Leticia.
yeah, and I know that's one of the things that's really frustrating for me when they blame victims and don't understand, right? When they blame victims like she must have done something or she picked bad people, right, to be with, and they don't understand that not all abusive relationships start off abusive, or who would stay. Abuse usually isn't apparent until well into the relationships, usually at points of investment when it's not so easy to leave, maybe after getting married, getting pregnant, or you completely isolated from your support system or financially dependent on the perpetrator. That's usually when things become more apparent. And statistics actually shows that in the beginning of most abusive relationships, in a 12-month period, there's probably one physical incident or one domestic violence incident. So people don't understand that it's not bad all the time, right? You have those bad incidents, but it's not bad the entire time. And it's not that victims are choosing bad people. That's their partners they love. And I think even when in non-abusive relationships, how it's difficult for anyone to experience a loss of any relationship, right? Same thing applies. This person doesn't always behave that way. So yes, the love will exist. So Kimba, thank you for bringing that up because I think that's something that we really need to talk about more, because victims are usually blamed for being in an abusive
Yeah.
relationship because you just chose someone bad to be with.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep. And even with looking at the abuser, and as you point out, like the bad person, I mean, here in Virginia, Serena Fairfax and her husband, I mean, he was lieutenant governor. Nobody would think that, this is going on. And I think it
Yeah.
even goes to the degree of what needs to happen for our Black men, because it doesn't always show up as physical abuse,
Yeah.
of these other abuses, emotional, financial, psychological, all these things can be just as harmful as the physical abuse. And so, I'm just hard stop again.
No, you're absolutely right. I've had victims tell me during support group that they would rather him just get it over with the physical abuse because then it was like one and done, right? They heal. But it was the impact of the emotional and mental abuse that they were still dealing with years after leaving a relationship. So, I mean, not just statistically from experiences. So your experience is valid. Most survivors do state that the emotional and mental abuse have more impact than physical abuse on their well-being, unfortunately.
I echo all of that. And, as I hear these reflections too, it makes me think about two things. One, the way in which love and abuse for folks can be intertwined, especially when that was present in your home of origin, right? Of
Yeah.
like you understood that your mama and your dad or your parents that they loved you and your siblings loved you, but yet violence was present, right? And so this is one of the things that I feel very strongly about in the Black community. We need to talk about, the way in which violence may be present in the home, whether through, abusive dynamics or whether through discipline of kids, right?
Right.
And how that can actually allow folks to weave in that no, like someone can love me and they can beat me, okay? And so now this actually plays out. I see, like, in the trauma and recovery context, they talk about the intergenerational transmission of violence, right? How violence gets passed down from one generation to the next. And when you grew up in a violent household, how you're actually even more susceptible to witnessing violence be present in your adult relationships. And it makes sense. That's what happened to me, right? My
Yeah.
situation felt familiar. I was like, oh, I understand this. I'm actually not even afraid of this, right? And so we have to thread this too. And what also, as I'm hearing you, Letitia and Kemba, what's coming up for me really big also is trauma
Mhm.
and the way in which trauma and violence are inexplicably linked. I like two definitions of trauma. One is from someone named Gabor Mate, and he talks about trauma isn't what happened to you, but what happened inside of you as a result of what happened to you. that really inside piece. And another by Peter Levine who talks about, trauma is what happens in the absence of when violence occurs in the absence of an empathetic witness, right? And so we need to talk about the way in which trauma then is intertwined with violence. And I think, too, the way in which survivors know that. So you know this person's history and what they grew up with, and now there are economic stressors in the relationship or different things happening, and you could thread the story with the violence. So just wanted to reflect that as well.
Crystal, not you setting yourself up for another webinar. Because listen, all of that.
Yes.
So I have some questions. I want to go more into the trauma piece in just a second, but I wanted to get back to the institutional aspect of it as well. So when we think about system interactions, mandates, or expectations, how are we seeing those things impact survivor safety planning?
Yeah, I would say in many cases, usually, of course, when survivors are seeking help and safety, but instead they encounter usually blame, punishment, which usually could discourage them from future help seeking. But for example, when we're talking about institutional harm, right, causing more harm than good, as I stated earlier, um, I could recall times where survivors are maybe calling the law enforcement for their partner who is currently being abusive, but when law enforcement arrives, then they're seen as the aggressor because the perpetrator have a scratch, right? And maybe there were no other and they don't know how to determine the predominant aggressor, but the victim was calling for help. She wanted the abuse to stop, but instead she was arrested. That's
Hmm.
an example of institutional harm. And I've also seen, for example, in criminal court hearings where the victim is subpoenaed to testify against her perpetrator for the domestic violence charges, but she do not show up for fear, fear of retaliation or even facing that perpetrator. And I've seen judges issue material witness warrants for victims who didn't show up. So those are examples that come to my mind when I think of institutional harm for victims that did not do anything, of course, and they're being held more liable than the person who is actually perpetrating the violence, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
Would and I don't know if this aligns with that, but I mean, I can recall I actually called the police because I was living in Norfolk, Virginia at the time and saw a pimp beating up, one of his workers or girlfriend. And it was so traumatizing. I called the police. My husband was like, "Do you think we should call the police?" We called the police and we saw actually the policemen come and ask him, questioning. You could see them questioning them, but there was no like separation. Of course, if you're questioning the both of them and she's right there with him, she's gonna
Yeah.
say, "No, officer, nothing happened." And I'm sure maybe he didn't do what he's supposed to do. Maybe, police forces across the country do know to separate individuals, but it just seems like there should be more things in place as far as trainings with police officers, criminal justice stakeholders to understand more the breakdown with the mentality of someone that's going through abuse. And it may take a second for them to open up, but just the importance of making sure that time of separation is happening. And then also, when I do reflect on Serena Fairfax case here in Virginia, and I haven't done a deep dive honestly because it is traumatizing, and I knew him too, and her, but the fact that the judge, like she had cameras in her house.
Yeah,
And the judge had ordered him to move out, but nobody had the sense enough. Well, I know they don't really pay attention to domestic violence like they should here as far as judges and everything, but nobody thought that there should be immediate removal.
right.
So I just feel like there needs to be just more education because that just to even know those facts, it just doesn't make sense that that could have been, prevent it. And then, not to talk about the divorce laws here in Virginia. I mean, for whatever reason, and maybe it's in different places too, but you have this period of separation. You can commit adultery and not have that waiting period. But if it's a domestic violence and abuse, what I've been told is that you still have that separation period that needs to happen. And so, for whatever reason, whether it's the kids, bills, financially, or whatever, they were still under, the same roof. But that judge should have immediately known that. And I think because he had called the police on her one time to make it seem like she did something to him. But whatever the situation, they knew that there was some violence going on. There were multiple calls to the house. There should have been immediate separation. But nobody thinks through that.
Absolutely. I do think the courts often minimize survivors' abuse allegations when they're considering divorce and custody proceedings, right? And in Serena Fairfax's case, of course, there were claims of abuse, but yet they were still required to live together, right? Until she finally filed another order, and then he was ordered to be removed, and that's when, unfortunately, the murder suicide happened. But you also see in other cases where abuse is also again ignored, and survivors are required to still co-parent with the other parent, right? Going up and meet with them in public places with a restraining order in place. And what we know about domestic violence during separation and leaving is the most dangerous time. That's usually
Hmm.
when you see these homicides occur. So why are we telling survivors that they're still required to meet up with their perpetrators to exchange children or for a divorce proceeding? You still have to live with him this amount of time. We don't want to remove fathers from the home. So I think there's so much that need to be done. And also even with child welfare, when we're talking about institutional harm, oftentimes survivors are accused of failure to protect when they're when they're afraid for their own safety, So, and I know they're doing everything in their ability to keep themselves and their children safe, but there's just so much training that is needed across all systems, as you stated, Kimba. I couldn't agree more. Kimba, as a
You're fine.
And one thing that I do want to just make very clear for everyone listening too is as much as we're talking about law enforcement, child welfare, criminal legal justice systems, we're also talking about immigration services, we're also talking
Yes.
about social services, and we're definitely also talking about domestic violence services because I have seen a lot of atrocious things happen to survivors who had very high lethality or very high danger markers. And because, there were a lot of cases of even just survivors being screened out of services because you check their case search history and they happen to have, a conviction on there, or you check their, judiciary case search and they happen to have a theft charge. And then all of a sudden, every time something goes missing from the shelter, they're the ones being questioned, right? So to think about, there are so many different layers of institutional harm that are happening in conjunction for survivors. If we really have to play a much bigger role, especially I feel as this is my personal opinion, as domestic violence advocates, we have an especially important role when we know that survivors are navigating all of these complex and nuanced systems. We have a role of showing up even more, and showing up for survivors even more.
I completely agree. What's coming up is like there's this word that I appreciate that I first learned in this book called it's a little book of restorative justice and it's called On Trauma Healing. Um and it's called traumagenic, which means and it's applied to institutions and systems and seeing these agents as producers of trauma, that these very
Mm.
institutions can actually create trauma. And so when I'm hearing your story, Kemba, when I'm hearing your reflections, Letitia, I'm like, that's what these institutions are doing, right? And
Yes.
one of our founder of our center, her name is Linda G. Mills, and one of her earliest articles around domestic violence, it was a Harvard Law Review article in 1999, and it's called Killing Her Softly. And it
Mm.
talks about just that title in and of itself
Right.
Yep.
The way in which systems can actually mimic the abuse survivors are experiencing in their relationships by removing agency, self-determination, voice, and choice, and actually, implementing strategies that can make survivors less safe. So now I'm forcing you, for instance, victimless prosecution. You're saying I don't want to testify, and the system is now subpoenaing you to testify against the person who has hurt you, right? And so, all of these systems, child welfare, the criminal legal system, its go-to strategy is separation and isolation. And I'm not saying I'm all about a timeout. I think adults need
Right.
a timeout. I need a timeout sometimes, okay? I'm all about a timeout, okay? The issue I have with these systems is that the result is the strategy is let me separate you and isolate you without, like, think about when we have kids, we're like, okay, go to your room for a second, you did something we need to address, and then we come back out and say, okay, so what we gonna do now? Where is the what are we going to do now,
Yeah.
right? And in fact, what you do is you leave survivors to clean up the mess on their own while
Yeah.
you might have advocated for a strategy that they weren't advocating for. So, how do we? It ties into what y'all are saying about, the education that I found, sadly, you know, uh, in many of these systems, folks are not educated about the ways in which these strategies like separation, like isolation, can actually, to your point, Letitia, make survivors less safe. And so we need to also embed that education so we're not just replicating the harm and making punishing survivors and actually invoking their stories, saying that we're advocating for public safety when what we're seeing on the ground is something different.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just hearing you and reflecting, I mean, ultimately the system chose to, and with me and other women that have experienced abuse and, with someone that may have a criminal lifestyle where you put them in the system and there's no what next. Like, so coming out, I had to go to therapy, but still didn't understand protecting myself and making sure that I'm in a healthy relationship and valuing myself. And actually valuing myself was even worse because the system caused additional harm because I'm in the system thinking I'm a bad person you know, and so having to come out of that situation and heal is linear. And so anyone listening, and I know some people in this workspace are in it because of passion, because they've experienced it. But I just encourage us all just to continue to strive forward with healing. And even if your clients you're intaking all of this information, that is just really important for us to make sure that we're centering ourselves and healing from these experiences.
Absolutely. So I'm gonna mix up the questions a little bit because y'all are just answering them as you go. Um, So societally, we know, and we definitely, all of us on this call understand that Black women are put to different labels or different labels put to us, different racialized tropes such as the strong Black woman, the angry Black woman, welfare queen, bad mothers, perceptions that Black girls are inherently less innocent, even. How do all of these narratives impact survivor advocacy and system response specifically?
I mean, I think in short, for me, it's just, people blame, it causes people to blame the victim that when you use those titles, and they don't want to look at the complexity of the relationship and grooming and how certain things go on, but they just want to, um, feel like that person deserved it because of their bias of who they are.
Hmm.
Right. I think it could be harmful because as Black women, we're expected to endure hardship without receiving support,
Yeah.
usually leading others to assume that we're less in need of protection, less emotionally harmed, and more capable, I guess, of handling the abuse on our own, which is not true. We're sometimes even viewed as angry or hostile when we are expressing our fear or frustration. Again, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but just not seen as that perfect victim, right? Because of the way we express ourselves, them not understanding culturally, how we often come across. But we talked about also how sometimes just this stereotype could be harmful because we're misidentified as the victim and seen as a primary aggressor sometimes and often end up arrested. So
Mhm.
that all plays a part into becoming more criminalized, such as Kimba's case, unfortunately. So I think it definitely plays a role in systems interactions and how Black survivors are handled within these organizations.
I have a slight shift, but so I'm really thinking specifically about survivors that are working in communities of color or with culturally specific programs. How would you define respectability politics, and how have you seen it show up within advocacy spaces or when survivors are seeking services?
Gosh.
I know, got to think about that one.
I'll share this. Apol I told my mom, I tell my mama that I share this story, so I'll share it. So I'll share it. But I'll tell. So when I got locks, my mom, I'll never forget. I call my mama up and I'm like, Mom, I'm gonna lock my hair. And she's like, "Oh, baby, I gotta go." I'm like, "Girl, what?" So I call her back and I'm like, Mom, I'm gonna lock my hair. And she said, Oh yeah, I gotta go. And of course, I knew what was going on. My mom, as a woman who emigrated here from the Caribbean, from Jamaica, and was told that to survive this context, to be seen as human in this context, she had to do certain things. So that looked like dressing a certain way. That looked like having her hair a certain way, that looked like speaking a certain way, not being too loud, not all of these things, and developing these survival strategies to survive the violent context that is white hetero patriarchal supremacy. Okay. And so when she's hearing her daughter, who, she has so many dreams and hopes for, saying that she wants to lock her hair, she's thinking about, well, how is my girl going to be perceived, right? Because that was something 20, 30 years ago when I was moving to this country that could have easily resulted in a presumption around me that would make me be treated as less human. Okay. So I share that story, one, because I want to have compassion for us. I think it's really important and empathy that so many Black people have had to try to figure out, right? Like, how do we survive this? And in a context where I have kids, I don't want to tell my kid that they can't drive in the same way and they need to be really worried when around police off. How do I protect my kids from state violence? Okay. And so I think, what are the long-term legacies and ramifications of this? That this is very much still present today, that and how we perceive each other. So someone
Yeah.
shared this with me, like this story about like how actually like during the civil rights movement, Fannie Lou Hamer was perceived, right? For being someone that didn't want to ascribe to these notions of what assimilation, Black assimilation looked like during this time, right? And so I think it's resulted in us um, labeling each other as who's deserving of who's not. I mean, the things like don't embarrass me, okay? I grew up in a household where people don't embarrass me. Crystal,
Yeah.
did you iron your shirt?
Yeah.
You look
My mom still talks about the iron to this day. She's like, girl, iron your stuff.
shirt. And that trickles in to even how us as, culturally specific organizations, Black organizations within the um, DV context can perceive survivors who are walking in, and
Mhm.
that like actually white supremacy, like none of us are immune to this virus that has allowed us to see ourselves through the lens of the white gaze, right? And so I think it first starts with like being really honest about how your own bias is showing up,
Hmm.
how your own stories of who you've been told you need to be in order to be seen as human within the context that is America shows up, and how that might be coloring the way that you're able to hold another person's humanity who's a survivor. So I feel like it really starts with that own internal work and being willing to interrogate our own stories, um, and being honest about when your own story is getting in the way of you being able to hold a survivor in their
Yeah.
humanity, and asking for support, within your organization of actually, like, when I meet with this person, like, I might not be the best person to meet with this survivor, right? So is there anyone else, right? And or if I'm recognizing that this is a growing edge, this is something that I'm wanting to step into, how do you get support, right? Because this is really important. So those would be the reflections I have on this. We gotta do our own internal work.
Yeah.
Right. No, and I have to agree with Crystal, of course, just doing this work and, here in my state, like most of the domestic violence programs are led by white women. You wouldn't have many black executive directors, right? So they're responsible for the hiring decisions, so when going to an interview and, black women in our hair, right? This is the same state who shot down the Crown Act when we tried to get it passed, so that was definitely an issue, just being mindful and having to code switch just to be able to get employed or actually be respected in the field, right? Just being aware of how you dress, how you speak. And I can't change my accent. This is how I speak. I show up as me, but all of those things that are usually required for you to fit in this social norm, right? To be deemed acceptable. All of that plays a part, not only as an advocate, but also for survivors. They face the same issues, in order to get adequate resources and services. They want to see if they're composed and they're modest. Are they educated? How do they dress? How do they show up? How do they speak? So all of those things definitely played a part, which is very unfortunate in the advocacy support services.
Yeah,
It's
I
it's
could
unfortunate.
go ahead, go ahead.
Mhm.
No, just briefly, it's unfortunate because I also remember, I went in, pregnant, and when I gave birth to my um, son, my dad knew that I was going to be going into the hospital in, braids, orange jumpsuit, handcuffed, and so he went to the hospital ahead of time to kind of let them know that I was coming because he was concerned about how people would have that implicit bias about me. And so he was able to make the connection. And I think, I think about other women and other people don't have that kind of support. And it shouldn't matter what you look like, what your personal experience is that we need to see the humanity in people. But yeah, I just thought I would add that.
No, absolutely. And I could talk about respectability politics all day, trust me. But I was just even thinking about all the points you all were making of, there's a survivor side and what survivors are experiencing in terms of having to navigate and deal with respectability politics. And then there's the advocate side. And I always point out to organizations, if you can't work with the advocates that you serve, there is no
Mm,
way that you're adequately serving the survivors that are coming in. Like if you don't
Absolutely.
understand, the pressure that it would be to have to retwist my hair every week and what that means, like then there's no way you're going to understand why a survivor says they need a new weave to go get to, go apply for
Right.
this job that you tell them that they have to have, right? And so there's so many, again, just layers and narratives and nuances that people really need to, again, do that internal work.
Mhm.
And with the internal work, you also have to call things out when you're seeing them. So if you work in an organization and you're doing your internal work and you're doing a great job at it, and you're also recognizing that somebody else on staff is maybe needing to build their capacity, call it out. Like call them
okay,
in, or call it
do
out
that.
either way, but don't act like it's not happening because it's still, again, that institutional harm that's then
Harmful.
happening to survivors. And so what does it mean to you all to provide advocacy that actively resists systemic harm instead of simply unintentionally reproducing it. Because that's what a lot of people say. Well, we're trying to make sure it doesn't happen, but they're not actively working to ensure it doesn't.
Right. Repeat it, Ayana. Repeat the question.
Yeah. What does it mean to provide advocacy that actively resists systemic harm instead of simply unintentionally reproducing it?
Right. For me, I think, of course, center in the survivor's autonomy, right? And lived experiences instead of trying to control or speak for them or even make decisions for them. I've seen advocates actually get caught up into making decisions for the survivor, but we have to realize that she's the expert in her life and she's going to know what's best. We also need to recognize, and this kind of goes to what we were just talking about, how racism and classism and other forms of oppression usually shapes people experience of violence. So just recognizing those things and then calling it out. And one thing, of course, just working at Ujima that we always advocate for, just avoiding a one size fits all approach, right?
Hmm.
Just catering to the victim based on their needs and their culture, so that we're adequately providing the support for them to sustain a healthy life free from violence.
Mhm.
I completely agree. The
Check,
survivor,
check.
yeah, to like check, check, truly. Like, um, and the survivor grounding in that this person is the expert on their experience, as you were saying, Letitia. And what does it mean to walk alongside, not over and not under a survivor, like
I like that.
catching their rhythm. And it's hard, but it's critical. And I was recently working with a survivor, and it was who I knew they were talking about as they were talking about the violence, it became very clear that this was a high lethality case. They were very adamant they did not want to involve systems. The reason that they got connected to me was because they were really interested in restorative process, which for high lethality cases, I just want to note that bringing people together is not an option, but they wanted something restorative in their healing journey. And I noticed that as they're sharing more details about what's going on, I feel it internally. I start getting activated, right? And so now I jump into safety planning mode, right? Of like, oh my God, we need to do this. And there in that moment, I could feel like there was a shift. And then they were safety planning. We end up getting off the call. And when I had reached out to them again the next day, um, I didn't hear from them, and I knew then immediately that I had walked over them, right? And one of the things that I want to offer this value of humility. The quality of our practice is is reflected by the quality of our reflection and our humility and our willingness to integrate it. So I say this very often, very early on when walking alongside survivors or folks who've caused harm, that like if I cause harm or hurt or walk over you, like I hope that we can create a relationship in which you feel safe enough naming that so that I can evolve in my practice. And so I end up reaching out to them and in the call, again and they answer, we got on the call and I apologized. I said I noticed after we got off the phone, I started thinking, man, like I was activated in that call, and I was walking over you, and I really want to walk alongside you. And they were so appreciative of the acknowledgement. And what they reflected in their feedback, which was so heartening to me, was, one of the reasons I reached out to for this avenue was because I wanted it to be different than what I had been offered before, right? What I've been offered before are people telling me that I need to do this and I need to do that. And it looks like the safety plan. It looks like this. And like that for me, where was my voice, right? And so I think that's so important of one, how do we walk alongside folks? You're gonna mess up, being okay with failing forward, but creating a relationship that doesn't, that then allows for you to repair in real time and then to move back into what alignment looks like. And then also doesn't look like, now walking under where now someone's saying all this stuff and you're just like, la, la,
Yeah.
la, la.
Like,
You're
oh,
not
thanks for sharing. That's it.
for sharing, right? Um, and what walking alongside means, like, you can reflect what you're noticing, right? Without stopping someone's autonomy and their self-determination to make the decision that's best for them. So just
Hmm.
want to reflect that as well.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything to add. I mean, hearing both of you all, I mean, it's obvious that you all do your work, and you put your heart and soul into it. But again, I would just echo to what you all have already said, just the importance of centering the individuals that are being impacted, and not just for them to be on a platform and telling their stories. I mean, I came out in 2000, and I that's what I would have been doing for a good portion after my release, but actually have that person at your strategic meetings when you're trying to plan out your mission, your vision for the rest of the year, and funding, and where the funding would be most useful for. And hearing those individuals and their influence can help guide you in some of the, and they'll feel more valued and integrated in being a part of the change, and not being harmed, and just because they're just sharing their story and they move on.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So I'm gonna ask I'll make this the last question so I can make sure to share your contact information out to everybody. So if you have one wish for the field, what would it be? And one wish specifically for Black survivors, what would it be?
Only one that's hard.
Well, you can give a couple if you want. If you're really like, Ayana, please, I can't do one.
Um, I think one wish for survivors. Of course, more culturally responsive domestic violence services for survivors and more resources, right? I feel like there's a big lack of resources specifically for survivors that are created for us by us. So that's number one. And also, Crystal touched on this a little bit, and also I think Kimba did as well, the need for culturally responsive intervention programs for
Mhm,
offenders. So
mhm.
it's something on my wish list, something we talked about inside Ujima that will probably come soon or, in the near future, but it's definitely something I think that is really needed in this work.
Because Crystal, you're a wordsmith girl, so I'm gonna let you close us out. But with um, with systems, just and I don't know if I'm saying this in the right order, but just to see the victims, just to hear the victims. Um, even when we go back to Puffy and Casey situation, there were so many people and still judge Casey and not understand, but just to be seen and hear people and have a clear understanding of the domestic violence cycle, and why why a person would stay. And I think we have so many people in society that are judgmental, that don't understand. So my wish for them is to be able to, for them to be seen by systems, and then for the survivors just to heal.
Mm, mhm.
And however that may be, with putting, you know, your feet in the sand, in the water, a certain time of the year, whether it be, actively going to therapy. I do therapy twice a month. Um, but that's because it's ongoing. And sometimes we think we're okay, and we're not. Sometimes we awful lot. Sometimes we overthink. Sometimes we have avoidance issues. And, I just want survivors, my wish is that they heal.
That's beautiful.
Yes.
There's all of that. There's nothing I would add. Truly, all of that. And what I would love to do is just close us out in a poem. that I'm dedicating to Black survivors of domestic violence and gender-based violence. And it's called Kemba. This is why love this, love this constellation of beings. It's called To Live. Because my wish for survivors is not to survive, to live. And the invitation as I read this poem, and wrote it really recently, for you to imagine that, and in either one of two ways, um, that we're reading it to survivors of domestic violence from the lens of all of the things that we've told you needed to do to survive, and actually asking you into a different call. And perhaps that's a mother or a grandmother, um, and or we're reading it to 7 generations from now, right? That instead of asking folks to survive, to let go of parts of themselves, we're going to ask them to live. So, with that, I'd love to share this poem. I hope these words wash over you in the way writing them has washed over me. To live. Mm. To survive, I forgot, left behind, erased, divided me, from them, from you. To survive, I suppressed, contorted, assimilated, let go of the teachings that were a part of my soul. And I did so because I loved you, because I didn't want you to hold, to bear the heartache, the pain, the heartbreak that haunted me so endlessly, that turned me into a ghost of myself. I didn't want it for you. And in not wanting it for you, I encouraged you to survive. But, beloved, I know now in a way I did not know then. And, beloved, I apologize for not knowing then that I don't want for you to survive. I want you to live. So to live, I I pray that you love so deeply your heart bursts. I pray that you never forget your teachings, your ancestors, those who prayed for you. And beloved, have we prayed for you? I pray that you see yourself as beautiful because you are. That you see yourself in the way the Creator sees you. I pray that you sing our songs, that you build the world that we deserve as opposed to the one we too often settle for. And above all else, beloved, I pray that you live. Thank you all so
Hey,
much.
Thank you,
hey, with
Crystal.
that one.
Beautiful.
Beautiful.
That was
Oh my
beautiful.
gosh.
Crystal,
Thank you
you're
for
not finna
sharing
take
that.
me out today. You're not finna take me out of
No,
here.
I
Brittany's
know.
Girl.
taking me out. I'm like, where's
Yes.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, thank
Y'all.
you for that. That was powerful.
Yeah.
Brilliant. As Kimba said, you're a wordsmith. I love it.
Somebody said no eyelashes left, girl. No eyelashes.
Mhm.
Got them things off. Thank you
I felt it.
yeah, like this has
Absolutely.
been an incredible conversation. This is more than just a conversation, and I really just appreciate you all so much for adding everything you did. Um, how can folks reach you? Letitia, drop your email so folks can reach out. Crystal, shout out your website and things. I'm gonna share Kimba's slide. She has a really nice QR code that's very easy to click on over to. So you can stay in contact with these folks because obviously we'll have you back. I'm gonna make a promise on that. We will have you all back for sure. And just, staying connected is so important to this work. So thank you all again. Crystal, Letitia, drop your stuff in the chat. Folks, grab a screenshot of this QR code. Us also shouting out Kimba's movie that she referenced. Yes, honey.
Streaming on BET Plus now if you're interested in watching it.
Yes. I
Yeah.
was like, this is gonna be so good. I can't wait to watch it.
Just
It's
have
Um,
some
really
tissue
good.
though.
Yo, yeah, I am
Absolutely.
prepared. I am prepared. I am
Thank
prepared.
you.
You almost took me out too on this call. I had to get myself together. Say, this is what happens when you put
Yeah.
makeup on, trying to be cute. Um, You all, thank you so much, folks in the audience. Please make sure you're taking care of yourselves. This was a fantastic conversation. I know brought a lot up for me, so make sure you're taking care of yourselves. Stay tuned for upcoming programming, Ujima Talks, webinars, Coffee and Convos with Ujima. Our next webinar is actually going to be on the 28th of this month. And Karma Kottman, who is our co-founder and CEO, will be leading us in that conversation around supporting Black survivors in rural communities. So it's going to be fantastic. Again, thank you all so much. Much love to you. We appreciate you for being here, and we'll have you back soon. And
Fabulous.
again, also thank you to our interpreters. You all are fantastic, and we appreciate
Yes.
you so, so much for providing services to us. All right, y'all. Be easy, be free, be safe out here. See y'all
Thank you.
soon.
Bye, beautiful
Bye.
people.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.